Step aside. You will not board this flight.
Excuse me, we've been cleared. Here are our boarding passes.
I said step back. Now.
Our kids are boarding with us. What's the problem?
You're creating a disturbance. Do you want to be detained?
We are being denied boarding for no reason. This is on record.
They were already in the boarding line. Shoes off. Belts back on. Passes scanned. One more step, and they'd be on the plane. That's when it happened. Not a siren. Not an announcement. Just a man in a uniform sliding sideways and closing the gap. The jet bridge was right there, close enough to touch. But suddenly, it might as well have been a locked door. Step back. No explanation. No warning. Just a hand out, palm forward, stopping a family in motion. Marcus Hill didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He did what people his age were taught to do. Stay calm. Stay respectful. Don't make it worse. He held up the boarding passes. The same passes that had worked 10 seconds earlier. The officer didn't look at them. He looked past Marcus, at the line, at the crowd, at the kids. And that's when the temperature changed. Because when authority ignores proof, it isn't about rules anymore. Tanya tightened her grip on her daughter's backpack. Her son leaned closer, whispering, "Mom, are we in trouble?" No one answered him. The officer said they were holding things up. Said there was a problem. Wouldn't say what the problem was. Marcus asked the question every adult in that terminal was thinking. What rule did we break? The reply came fast and sharp. You keep talking, this turns into something else. Every parent over 40 knows that tone. It's not a warning. It's a threat dressed as procedure. The children froze. They'd gone from vacation mode to survival mode in under 5 seconds. Behind them, people shifted. Some looked away. Some stared too long. A few quietly lifted their phones. Not to help, just to record. That's when the officer took one step closer. Not enough to touch. Close enough to intimidate. He mentioned detention. Casually. Like he was talking about a weather delay. And suddenly the message was clear. Comply, or we escalate. The boarding announcement continued overhead. Last names being called, final rows boarding. One by one, passengers walked past them. No one stopped. No one intervened. The boarding door slid shut with a soft mechanical click. That sound landed harder than any shout. The plane was leaving. And they weren't on it. Not because they were late. Not because they were unqualified. Not because they did anything wrong. They stood there, parents trying to stay composed, kids trying not to cry, as the officer finally stepped aside. Not to let them through, but to block them from following. In that moment, it wasn't about a flight anymore. It was about how fast order turns into fear. When power refuses to explain itself. And how helpless you feel. When your children are watching. And you realize staying calm isn't enough to protect them. Marcus Hill is not a stranger to airports. He spent most of his adult life moving through them quietly, efficiently, without incident. Security lines. Boarding groups. Delays. Gate changes. He knows the routine the way some people know their morning commute. Senior IT consultant. 20 years in the same field. The kind of job that comes with early flights, tight connections, and a loyalty number memorized by heart. He flies often enough to know one simple truth. When something's wrong, someone always tells you why. Except this time. Tanya Hill is just as grounded. A healthcare administrator who manages staff schedules, compliance audits, and crisis calls without losing her composure. She spends her days solving problems, not creating them. Together, they're planners. Checklists. Confirmation emails. Screenshots saved just in case. This trip mattered. They were headed to a family wedding. The kind you don't miss unless you absolutely have to. Grandparents waiting. Cousins flying in from 3 states away. Photos already planned. Outfits picked weeks ago. And the kids? This was supposed to be the fun part. First time flying. Backpacks packed by small hands the night before. Window seats negotiated and renegotiated. Questions about clouds, turbulence, and whether pilots eat lunch in the sky. At the gate, they were excited. Not loud, not restless. Just kids leaning forward, watching planes taxi by, imagining takeoff. There were no red flags. No alerts. No side conversations. No hushed radio calls. They hadn't been pulled aside at security. No extra screening. No whispered instructions passed between officers. Nothing. That's what makes the stop so jarring. Because nothing about the Hill family fits the profile of a problem. They weren't rushing. They weren't arguing. They weren't confused about where to go. They were early. And yet, in a matter of seconds, the atmosphere shifted. Excitement drained out of the kids' faces. Confusion replaced it first, that wide-eyed look when rules suddenly change without explanation. Then anxiety set in. Not loud panic. Quiet fear. The kind that shows up when children realize the adults don't have answers. Marcus stayed steady. Tanya stayed composed. But inside, both of them were doing the same calculation every parent does in moments like this. Say too little, you lose control. Say too much, it gets worse. They weren't thinking about lawsuits. They weren't thinking about headlines. They were thinking about their children watching every move. Learning, in real time, how quickly ordinary can turn uncertain. 5 minutes earlier, this family was boarding a plane. Now, they were standing in a terminal, singled out, trying to understand how a routine morning had quietly slipped into something else entirely. The explanation came after the outcome, and even then, it barely qualified as one. The officer said there was a behavioral concern. Not behavior that had already happened. Not a rule that had been broken. Just a concern. Vague. Flexible. Impossible to challenge. Marcus asked him to clarify. What behavior? The question was calm. Measured. The kind of question professionals ask when something doesn't add up. The officer didn't answer it. Instead, he repeated the command. Step back from the gate. That was the first signal this wasn't about order. It was about control. Tanya asked for a supervisor. Not loudly. Not dramatically. The way adults are told to ask when something feels wrong. The officer's jaw tightened. I'm the one you're dealing with. Another request followed. Still respectful. Still restrained. Again, the same response. No name. No badge number. No escalation path. Just repetition. Every word became shorter. Sharper. The boarding agent glanced over. Eyes flicked between the officer and the family. For a moment, it looked like she might intervene. Then she didn't. Because in places like airports, authority has layers. And once a uniform steps in, everyone else steps back. The agent deferred. Not because she agreed, but because she didn't have the power to disagree. The officer told the family they were delaying the process, that their questions were creating a disruption. Behind them, the line had already rerouted. Passengers were boarding through a different lane. The disturbance existed only in his narrative. Marcus pointed that out, carefully. We're standing where you told us to stand. The officer leaned in slightly. That's enough. 2 words. No policy attached. No rule cited. Tanya asked again for a supervisor. This time, the response carried a warning. You keep pushing, and this becomes a bigger issue. That's when the children noticed the shift. They'd heard raised voices before. They'd seen adults disagree. But this was different. This was one person deciding the rules in real time, and no one else stepping in. The officer gestured toward the side of the terminal. Move over there. Not a request. An order. The family hesitated, just for a second. Not out of defiance, but confusion. That second was all it took. The officer labeled it noncompliance. A word heavy enough to justify anything that came next. 2 more staff members appeared. Not because the situation had escalated, but because the label allowed it to. No paperwork was produced. No boarding denial slip. No printed explanation. Nothing the family could hold on to. Nothing they could appeal in the moment. Just instructions to move. As they were escorted away from the gate, the officer spoke louder. Not to them, but to the room. So others would hear. So the story would be set. Passengers watched as the family was guided past the seating area. Past the monitors flashing final call. Some people looked uncomfortable. Some looked relieved it wasn't them. The children stayed silent now. That was the hardest part. They weren't asking questions anymore. They were watching their parents, trying to understand how authority works. The officer stopped near a blank stretch of wall. Wait here. No timeline. No explanation. No accountability. Just space and silence. In less than 10 minutes, a routine boarding had turned into an enforced removal. Without a single documented reason. No charges. No accusation. No evidence. Only power. Exercised fully. And answered to no one. They watched the departure time change before anyone said a word. The screen above the gate flickered once. Then locked in. Departed. No announcement. No explanation delivered to them. Just a quiet confirmation that the plane was gone. Marcus looked down at his phone, refreshing the airline app. As if the result might change if he checked it again. It didn't. The jet bridge was empty now. The line gone. The energy drained out of the space like air from a tire. That's when the children broke. Not loudly at first. Just tears they try to hold back. The kind kids cry when they're confused more than scared. The youngest asked the question every parent dreads hearing in public. Dad, what did I do wrong? Marcus didn't answer right away, because there was no answer that made sense. Tanya knelt beside them, her voice steady even as her hands shook. You didn't do anything wrong. She said it twice, once for the children, and once for herself. A few rows away, people were still staring. Some whispered. Some pretended not to see. A man across from them tilted his phone just enough to keep recording. The officer remained close enough to hear everything. On his body cam, his tone shifted. Relax now. Casual. He remarked that the family had pushed it too far, that they could have just listened. The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. Dismissal doesn't require volume. Only certainty. Minutes passed. Then more. Finally, a supervisor arrived. Not in a hurry. Not alarmed. The first thing he asked wasn't what happened. It was whether the situation was under control. The officer nodded. The supervisor glanced at the departure board. The flight was already gone. That's when Marcus spoke. Can you explain why we were denied boarding? The supervisor didn't answer the question directly. He said there had been a security-related delay. No details. No policy reference. No acknowledgement of the children still crying beside him. Tanya asked if they could file a formal complaint. The supervisor said someone would follow up. No names. No timeline. No apology. Not for the missed flight. Not for the embarrassment. Not for the kids watching their parents be sidelined and silenced. The airline staff returned briefly. They handed Marcus a printed slip. 2 lines of text. Passenger unable to board due to security delay. That was it. No mention of officer discretion. No mention of commands. No mention of threats. Just a phrase broad enough to cover anything. And accountable to no one. As they walked away from the gate, the weight finally settled in. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a mix-up that could be fixed with a phone call. The moment had passed. The damage was already done. Their children had learned a lesson no parent plans to teach. That rules can change without warning. That explanations aren't guaranteed. And that asking questions can cost you something. By the time they reached the terminal exit, the tears had stopped. Not because the hurt was gone, but because it had sunk in. This wasn't just about a missed flight. It was about standing in a public place, doing everything right, and realizing how quickly dignity can be taken, without anyone ever admitting it happened. For the first few days, there was nothing to respond to. No call, no follow-up, no explanation beyond the same recycled phrase, security delay. Marcus filed the request the way professionals do when they've learned not to rely on goodwill. In writing, through official channels, time-stamped and documented. He asked for the bodycam footage. Not because he wanted revenge, because he wanted clarity. When the files finally arrived, they didn't come with an apology or a cover letter. Just a link. And a warning that the footage might be difficult to interpret without context. They watched it at their kitchen table. All the moments they remembered as tense were calmer than they'd realized. No shouting, no refusal, no aggressive gestures. Just questions, and answers that never came. The footage showed Marcus holding the boarding passes, clearly. Showed Tanya standing still, asking for a supervisor, politely. Showed the children doing nothing at all. The escalation didn't begin with the family. It began with the officer's tone. Short commands, dismissive interruptions, a posture that closed space instead of managing it. On camera, the so-called behavioral concern never appeared. There was no disruption until it was created. They requested the TSA footage next. Different angle. Same story. The timestamps lined up. The movements matched. No sudden motion. No hesitation that justified force. No reason for denial. What the video did show was something harder to explain away. The officer stepping in first. The officer raising his voice first. The officer invoking detention before any rule was broken. Then the passenger videos surfaced. One appeared online quietly, shaky, from behind a seat row. Then another. Then a third. Strangers who had been standing in line. Recording not because they knew what was happening, but because something felt wrong. Within hours, the clips were being shared. Not with captions screaming outrage. With captions asking questions. Why are they stopping this family? They look calm. What did they do? The comments filled in the gaps faster than any press release. People recognize the pattern. And once that happens, explanations start to matter. The airline issued a statement. Short, carefully worded. They said they were reviewing the incident. The police department followed with their own response. confirming an ongoing internal review. No mention of the footage. No mention of the children. But it was too late to control the narrative. Because the footage controlled it now. Side-by-side clips began circulating. The officer's body cam next to TSA video. Next to passenger recordings. Different angles. Same outcome. The claim of disturbance didn't survive comparison. Every time the officer's report was quoted, someone would post the video beneath it. And the contradiction was impossible to miss. Report said noncompliance. Video showed stillness. Report said escalation. Video showed restraint. Report said security concern. Video showed a family waiting to board. The story shifted. Not overnight, but steadily. The question stopped being what happened. It became why was it described this way? That's when the tone changed. The airline updated its statement. This time, expressing regret for the experience. The police department acknowledged procedural issues. Careful words. Chosen to concede nothing, while signaling concern. But the damage to the original story was already done. Once people see with their own eyes, they don't forget. And once the footage speaks, the silence that came before it starts to look deliberate. What had been dismissed as a routine delay was now something else entirely. A recorded moment where power moved first. Explanation came last. And accountability only appeared after the evidence forced it into the open. Once the footage was public, silence was no longer an option. Marcus didn't go looking for an attorney. Attorneys came looking for him. Civil rights lawyers who had seen this pattern before. Not in headlines, but in filings. In depositions. In settlements buried behind careful language. He chose one who didn't promise outrage. He promised records. The claim was filed quietly at first. No press conference. No speeches on courthouse steps. Just facts. Racial discrimination in a place of public accommodation. Denial of service without cause. Emotional distress inflicted on minor children in a controlled environment. Nothing exaggerated. Nothing speculative. Every allegation tied directly to video, timestamps, and policy, or the absence of it. Discovery moved faster than the city expected. Requests went out for training manuals. Use of authority guidelines. Boarding denial procedures involving law enforcement. What came back was thin. Too thin. There was no written policy that allowed an airport officer to deny boarding based on a behavioral concern, without articulating the behavior. No checklist. No escalation ladder. No requirement to involve a supervisor before removing a family from a flight. The authority the officer claimed to be exercising existed mostly in practice, not on paper. Then came the personnel file. Officer Keller had been flagged before. Not disciplined. Flagged. Complaints that never quite stuck. Passengers who felt targeted. Professionals who described interactions as unnecessarily confrontational. Each complaint resolved the same way. Insufficient evidence. Officer acted within discretion. Until now. Because discretion collapses when patterns emerge. Internal emails surfaced during discovery. Supervisors acknowledging Keller was direct. Old school. Not great with de-escalation. No corrective action documented. No retraining mandated. The city's defense shifted. They stopped insisting the officer acted appropriately and started arguing the harm was limited. That's when the children entered the case, formally. Psychological evaluations documented anxiety tied directly to the incident. Sleep disruption. Fear of travel. Questions about police that didn't exist before. The family hadn't sought those evaluations for a lawsuit. They sought them because their kids weren't the same. That changed everything. The city knew juries don't like ambiguity, but they especially don't like watching children pay for adult misconduct. Negotiations began quietly. Airport authority representatives, city attorneys, insurance carriers, everyone careful with language. Everyone aware of the footage still circulating online. The numbers started low. They always do. The Hills didn't counter emotionally. They countered with exhibits. Side-by-side videos. Policy gaps highlighted. Complaint history summarized. Every time the city minimized the impact, the attorney redirected the conversation back to one simple fact. No rule was broken. No explanation was given. And no one stopped it. That's not an accident. That's a failure. The closer the case moved toward trial, the more uncomfortable the risk became. Because this wasn't a case about resisting authority. It was about what happens when authority refuses to explain itself, and institutions protect it by default. The city didn't want a jury hearing why a calm family was treated like a threat and why no one intervened. They didn't want executives testifying about policies that didn't exist. They didn't want Officer Keller's past complaints read aloud in open court. Pressure built quietly, then all at once. The settlement discussions turned serious, not because the city admitted wrongdoing, but because the evidence left no safe narrative. When the agreement was finally reached, it wasn't framed as justice. It was framed as resolution. But the number told the real story. $4.5 million. To close a case that should never have existed. And a recognition, unspoken, but clear, that the footage didn't just show what happened. It showed what the system allowed, until it could no longer deny it. The settlement didn't make headlines immediately. There was no parade, no televised press release, no celebratory statements, just the quiet acknowledgement that this chapter was closed. $4.5 million. A number large enough to get attention, but more importantly, a number that carried a clear message. When evidence exists, silence isn't enough. Marcus and Tanya Hill didn't sign away their voices. There was no non-disclosure agreement restricting them from speaking about the experience. They could tell their story, openly and truthfully, to anyone who would listen. And many did. The airport acted quickly on the internal side. Officer Keller was removed from airport duty. Not suspended indefinitely. Not quietly reassigned. Removed. For the first time, accountability had a visible consequence. For him. For anyone watching. Mandatory bias training became part of airport policy. Not a suggestion. Not an optional workshop. A required program for all airport law enforcement personnel. And boarding denial procedures were revised. No longer could a single officer make a subjective call without documentation. No longer could authority operate without transparency. The policies reflected a hard lesson. Power without accountability is dangerous. Even in places designed for safety, discretion can be weaponized. Even without a raised hand, a family can be blocked from travel, humiliated in public, and forced to watch their children internalize fear. It's easy to think of abuse as visible only in cuffs, in arrests, in loud confrontations. But the Hills' experience proved otherwise. Denial is quieter than arrest, but just as damaging. A boarding gate, a flight departure, a few minutes of inaction. All of it can ripple into months of anxiety and emotional trauma. Cameras don't stop discrimination. They don't prevent authority from misusing power. What they do is expose it. And when exposure happens, institutions are forced to respond. For the Hills, the settlement didn't erase the memory. Their children still remember the confusion. Marcus still remembers the helplessness of standing in line, watching authority ignore evidence and reason. Tanya remembers the tightness in her chest as she tried to protect the kids while remaining calm herself. But the resolution gave them something the airport couldn't: acknowledgement. Recognition that what happened was wrong. Recognition that the fear, the shame, and the lost flight mattered. Recognition that even ordinary people, parents, professionals, citizens, deserve fairness and clarity in public spaces. The broader takeaway is clear and necessary. Power can exist anywhere. It doesn't need handcuffs to be dangerous. A policy can be applied or ignored with equal force. A single individual can wield authority in ways that upend lives without justification. And yet, with evidence, the balance can shift. The truth doesn't always protect the innocent automatically, but it can hold systems accountable when individuals fail to do so. The Hill story is not just about a flight. It's about what happens when ordinary Americans face authority without oversight. It's about what happens when procedure is replaced by discretion. It's about what happens when children witness injustice in real time. The settlement, the policies, the training, all of it matters. Not just as redress for one family, but as a blueprint for prevention. And for anyone watching, the lesson lands hard. You don't have to be breaking the rules to suffer the consequences of someone else's misuse of power. Sometimes, it's enough to simply be standing in the wrong place at the wrong time, and to have cameras rolling. Because the cameras don't lie. They don't exaggerate. They don't invent the story. They just show what happened. And in the case of the Hills, that evidence was enough to make the system bend toward accountability. They never missed a rule. They missed a flight, and the truth followed. It's a sentence that could fit in a news headline, a courtroom, or a family living room. It's also a reminder: vigilance matters. Evidence matters. And even when institutions fail at first, Transparency can still force justice. The family moved forward. Not unscathed, not untouched, but with their story intact, with their dignity restored, and with the knowledge that a quiet, ordinary flight could change the way authority behaves in the future. Because in the end, sometimes a boarding pass isn't just a ticket to a plane. It's a ticket to accountability, and a reminder that fairness, though delayed, can arrive when the truth is undeniable.